Hello, and welcome to Grand Final History. In this episode, we go back to 1942, the 46th season of the VFL, a year where Australia was under direct threat from Japanese forces in the Pacific, resulting in a season unlike any other. Morale in Melbourne and Australia was low and falling in the early months of 1942, as the country struggled to absorb multiple shocks and setbacks, including the sinking of British battleships Repulse and Prince of Wales just 2 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the fall of Singapore, the bombing of Darwin, and more. Prime Minister John Curtin created a political and diplomatic shock in his speech at the very end of 1941 when he declared, "Without any inhibitions of any kind, I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom. Today, America dominates culture, politics, economics, entertainment, and more, so it's hard to understand why Curtin's statement was so shocking. However, Australians of the 1940s considered themselves both Australians and Britons, proud members of the British Empire. Travelling to England was literally described as going home. In 1939, then Prime Minister Menzies had stated, because Britain was at war, so too was Australia. He did not even consider it as a question to be discussed. Britain was at war, by definition, so was Australia. In 1942, with Japan directly threatening Australia, Curtin was pivoting, to use a modern term, to the US, despite the historical, cultural, and emotional ties to Britain. Australia's very survival was at stake, and only the Americans could help. Curtin summed up the situation facing Australians in February 1942 in a clear, unambiguous speech, when he said, "The ordinary way of life has gone, and no longer will the government appeal. It will order and direct." In late February, Curtin took on Winston Churchill, who was insisting that the Australian Army 7th Division, already on ships returning from the Middle East, be sent to Burma rather than Australia. Churchill even ordered British Navy commanders of that flotilla to head to Burma. Curtin demanded, via telegram, that Australian troops be returned to Australia, and Churchill reluctantly conceded that the Australian government would direct where Australian troops went. The ships returned to their original course, traditional power structures were unravelling, and new patterns were being established. Wartime demands took absolute precedence, and here's an example to highlight just how far this extended. In February and March, the government announced that all binoculars had to be registered and were subject to compulsory acquisition. They were needed for critical military purposes, like aircraft spotting and artillery ranging. Unauthorised use of binoculars could result in fines and confiscation. This obviously affected industries like horse racing and even sports journalists. While most people were willing to do their part and surrender their binoculars, not everyone was pleased. Resentment brewed when young officers on weekend leave were spotted at race meetings, improperly using binoculars. Binoculars that some punters recognised as their own, meant for military use. It goes to show, even during a war, people don't always act as they should. And speaking of racing, 1942 was a year like no other for the Melbourne Cup. Held on a Saturday, November 21st. There was no public holiday due to wartime conditions, and race meetings were heavily restricted. The winner, Colonus, claimed a victory by an impressive 7 lengths. Instead of the traditional Gold Cup, the owner received a £200 austerity loan bond, a sign of the times. American troops started arriving in March. By June, there had already been 250 marriages between American servicemen and Melbourne women. There was a moral panic about women drinking and picking up GIs. The drinking age for females was raised from 18 to 21, and a special police unit set up to patrol parks and gardens to prevent, without much success, romantic encounters. There was also the tragic Brownout murders. 3 young women assaulted and killed in the darkened wartime city. An American private, Edward Leonsky, was court-martialed by a US military court rather than being tried by the Victorian legal system. He confessed, was condemned to death, and hanged at Pentridge. Debate about Leonsky's sanity was not going to stop the verdict nor the sentence. The city was panicking, and justice had to be seen to be done. The League's head office, Harrison House, was commandeered for military use, and the VFL administration moved to Anzac House to run their operations. The MCG was designated as a storage site for ammunition, which would have ruined the stadium for years to come. Fortunately, plans changed, and the ground was used for troop accommodation. In April, the United States Army Air Force moved in, and the MCG became Camp Murphy after Colonel William Murphy, who had been shot down and killed by the Japanese in Indonesia. While the name of the camp was announced, the location was not published in newspapers due to security reasons. The news that the MCG was not going to be available for football was rather cryptic. The short article simply said the trustees had been informed that the ground was required for other purposes. The other purposes was officially a secret. However, it's unlikely anyone in Melbourne did not know that the MCG was now a military base, given the number of US personnel, the endless taxi trips to and from the MCG, the Saturday night dances put on by the US officers in the long room, and the fact that no football was being played there. Whether the Japanese ever found out the MCG's new role is a question for others. The US Army Air Force moved out in December, replaced by the RAAF for a short period of time, before the US Marines took over in 1943. The workplace was also different in 1942, with women moving into jobs previously held by men. Some into factories, others into offices, and, in one example of change, women were allowed to be conductors on trams. Initially resisted by the Tramways Union, who said that only men could be conductors, and that the Tramways management only wanted to introduce women to save costs, given that females received just 2/3 of men's wages. So, in a unique move, women conductors were paid the same rate as men, but they would only be employed for the duration of hostilities. It was the first time in Australia that the principle of equal pay for men and women for equal work was implemented. Amid the war's heavy toll, there were lighter moments that brought comfort and joy. One example was the debut of one of the most beloved songs of all time, White Christmas. First recorded by Bing Crosby, it quickly captured hearts. Since its release, Crosby's version alone has sold over 50 million copies. Cover versions have sold more than 100 million copies, a timeless classic that continues to resonate today. Bing Crosby's version of the Irving Berlin song was recorded in just 18 minutes in May 1942, and its nostalgic tone and memories of home captured the spirit of the time. Another classic of 1942 was the movie Casablanca. Released in November and considered by many to be one of the best films of all time. Even if the line "Play it again, Sam" was never in the script, that has never stopped sub-editors using the headline on almost any article involving a footy player called Sam. Let's focus on the footy now. 1942 began with debate on whether the VFL should continue given the threat from Japan and wartime demands. Collingwood, Melbourne and Hawthorn voting for a suspension of the competition. However, the VFL would proceed. In other states, there were different arrangements. Western Australia moved to an underage competition. In Adelaide, the SANFL moved from an 8-team league to a 4-team competition with merged clubs, while in Tasmania, the main leagues ceased playing. March 1942 did see football being played in Darwin, just weeks after the first Japanese bombing raids. However, players were in full battle dress and spectators were wearing helmets. Despite the delegates' commitment to proceed, all through March and April, there was still confusion and uncertainty about which grounds would be available. The 1942 season was still in doubt in mid-April. The Argus reporting that unless the league could be assured of at least 3 grounds, the season would be cancelled. With 3 grounds, 2 double headers could be played and a single match on the 3rd ground to allow the season to proceed. A pivotal moment was the VFA's decision to suspend operations at a meeting on the 20th of April, given uncertainty on grounds and whether clubs would have enough players to field teams. The Williamstown Chronicle summed up the situation. Certainly, the decision to suspend play, given the fine progress made over the past 3 or 4 seasons, must have went against the grain of the men who have stuck to the association through its darkest days. But it is far better to grapple with the facts than cling to illusions. A meeting between the VFL and VFA officials at Anzac House, the league's new home, produced a gentleman's agreement where current VFA players could move to VFL clubs, but they would return to the VFA when it resumed operations. The following day, 23 players, including stars like Tommy Laeth and Lance Collins, moved to VFL clubs. The cooperation even included Port Melbourne president and sometimes fierce league critic Tom Griffin taking a seat on the South Melbourne committee, as a number of Port players went to South Melbourne. Yet, the spirit of goodwill had limits. Players who had left the VFL without clearances, including stars such as Pratt, Nash, Todd and Fothergill, were not allowed to return until they had completed their 3-year suspension. Australia might have been facing the threat of invasion, but this was no time to forgive players for deserting the league without a clearance. Pratt, Nash, Todd, Fothergill and many other impacted players enlisted for military service, which restricted their football playing options in addition to the league's stubbornness. Geelong also suspended operations. Petrol rationing and reduced train travel meant that it was not feasible for them to compete. The league still required Geelong to pay £100 each season they were out to maintain their place in the competition. Many Geelong players were given temporary clearances to other clubs who were desperate for players. Given the absence of Geelong and with so many players on active service, the Brownlow Medal was suspended for the duration of the war. The league reserves competition was also reduced. With Geelong already out, both Collingwood and Hawthorn also declined to field second 18s. They were going to have enough trouble getting their first 18 out onto the field. Games were played on a range of different grounds this season. Melbourne left the MCG for Punt Road, sharing with Richmond. St Kilda left the Junction Oval for Toorak Park, and Footscray went to Yarraville, given Paran and Yarraville were both in recess along with the rest of the VFA. South Melbourne had the biggest displacement, moving north of the city to Princess Park, sharing with Carlton. This was the most challenging relocation. In this era, most players lived and worked near the club they played for. They could train at the Albert Cricket Ground, but petrol rationing meant that most players and officials would have relied on public transport or maybe even bikes to get from South Melbourne to Carlton on match days. Collingwood initially trained at Northcote before returning to play at Victoria Park, which was partially occupied by Southern Command, who, amongst other things, was using the arena to teach men to ride motorcycles. At one point in the lead-up to the season, there was serious talk of a temporary merger between Melbourne and Collingwood, which would have been something of a culture clash. But both clubs chose to proceed on their own. Jack Dyer even met with Prime Minister Curtin and asked him what he should do. Curtin, who knew his football, having played for Brunswick in the VFA, and was also a long-time mate of Jock McHale. He told Dyer, "I want you in Melbourne. Stay here and entertain the crowds. All the soldiers want to do is hear about the football, Jack. It keeps them going." Curtin had one request. Stop belting his nephew, Claude Curtin, in his 4th year at Fitzroy. Jack said he would try. However, Dyer did tell the following story in one of his many columns about the next time the Tigers played Fitzroy. "Next time I encountered Claude, I decided to be a trifle more gentle. After all, the PM had too many important things on his mind to have to worry about his nephew. But things happen. A well-packed maroon jumper got in my way and I put my shoulder through it. Inside that Guernsey was the luckless Claude. I made off up the ground. The Richmond players I left behind were not too happy. The crowd pelted them with bottles and fruit." 1942 saw 3 coaching changes in the VFL, a very low number by the standards of the era. Roy Cazaly took over from Bert Mills at Hawthorn. Cazaly had been a champion player at St Kilda in South Melbourne before spending time as captain coach in Tasmania and had 2 stints coaching South Melbourne. Most recently, he'd coached Camberwell in the VFA in 1941, even playing a couple of games late in the season, presumably when the club had trouble getting players because of the war. He may have been 48, but he still played at centre-half forward, the natural home of champions. Cazaly was appointed as Hawthorn coach in October 1941 and told the Hawthorn committee that the only obstacle to the team's progress was an inferiority complex. His first job would be to get rid of that. Cazaly would make some big changes at Hawthorn, but we will have to wait one more season for one of the most significant innovations. More on that next episode. The phrase "up there Cazaly" is part of Australian folklore and was being used in several war fronts as inspiration and a form of identification. A picture of Cazaly was even included in an article about Australian football published in many American newspapers in 1942, an explanation of this foreign code being seen for the first time by so many US soldiers. But something was lost in translation, and his name was given as Roy Cazalet. As discussed at the end of the last episode, Melbourne Premiership coach Frank Checker Hughes had resigned to spend more time on his hotel business. Getting staff during war times was a challenge, so he had to focus on the hotel rather than coaching. Percy Beames was the new captain coach. In an interview years later, he said that he had not applied for the role. Rather, he was called in by club president Joe Blair, and he was told he was captain coach. It was a difficult season for the debut coach, with many players in military camps or employed in essential services. Neither were allowed to knock off early to attend training, so often a good turn-up to training would be 7 to 10 players. St Kilda replaced Jack Knight with veteran ruckman Reg Garvin as captain coach. Reg had joined the Saints in 1937 and brought a wider sporting background than most players of his time. Growing up in Sydney, he had played soccer at school and rugby league, even playing a couple of senior games with Canterbury Bankstown, before switching back to Australian football for Newtown, prior to joining the Saints. One of a small number of players to have played senior rugby league as well as VFL. He won the Saints Best and Fairest in 1941 and would be the next in a long line of coaches at St Kilda to try and get that club finals success. Fitzroy and Richmond played a pre-season game as a fundraiser for patriotic funds. Several American military VIPs were present and were impressed. General William Marquet, a staff officer for Douglas MacArthur, said, "This is the fastest football game in the world. There is nothing quite the same anywhere in the world." A consistent response from Americans was the amazement on the kicking skills of Australian footballers, who could drop kick 60 yards while on the run, something the locals took for granted. But the Americans, who were used to throwing the ball, were stunned. Checker Hughes even offered to coach an American team if they wanted to learn the local game. Fitzroy supporters were excited about the return of Hayden Bunton, who had been transferred to Melbourne. And while he did play the opening game of the season, he only played one more in round 3, his last game of VFL football. He at least got 2 wins for his last 2 games, which was better than for much of his time at the Maroons. The league had sent many footballs to all branches of the services as part of its support for morale. Now, whether it was from the league or elsewhere, one lucky sailor from HMAS Vampire, which sunk in the Indian Ocean after being attacked by Japanese aircraft, was able to use a football to stay afloat for more than 7 hours before he was rescued. While Americans were arriving on our shores in huge numbers for the first time, a veteran administrator, Percy Page, had some radical suggestions for Americanising the local code. So if you think the AFL follows too many American trends, maybe blame Percy. He started the idea back in 1942. His 2 main suggestions were to have unlimited interchange rather than just one substitute, and allow non-playing coaches to go onto the ground to provide advice and guidance. Interchange has been a part of the game since the 1970s, and the interchange bench expanded now to 5, including one substitute. And runners can also carry coaches' messages to players. So I wonder if Percy would be satisfied. He proposed the changes to make the game more attractive and to help expansion into the northern states and maybe even internationally. Not everybody agreed. In recent years, the AFL has, at times, staggered the release of the fixture, a policy not always appreciated by supporters. 1942 saw a very dynamic fixture process, given the challenge of confirming grounds. The season was 16 rounds, and in the first half of the season, the draw for the following Saturday was confirmed on the Wednesday of that week. It meant that some teams ended up with 2 byes, and some just had 1. Given teams got 4 points for the bye, it meant the fixture wasn't fair. But of course, the fixture has never really been fair, so that was one of the lesser problems of the year. One unusual consequence of awarding 4 points for the bye was a ruling by the League Tribunal that a bye would count as a playing Saturday for any disqualified player. Player payments were again reduced to 30 shillings, or half the pre-war and 1941 £3 per week rate. And with no VFA competition, there was nobody offering players any higher rates. Servicemen in uniform would be admitted to games for half price. There would be no more free tickets this season. Even getting jumpers and shorts for players would prove a challenge for the clubs. Rationing had been introduced, and getting a player onto the field required 29 coupons, 9 for the jumper, 10 for the boots, 6 for shorts, and 4 for the socks. There was talk of getting former players to return their jumpers to bolster supplies, and at the end of the season, Melbourne players were, for the first time, asked to return their jumpers after the last game, although they would get them back if they played again next season. Round 1 was on the 9th of May, and only 43,000 attended the 5 games, half of the number that attended the opening round of 1941, and a dramatic indication of the changing priorities of supporters. The football record included a welcome to the American visitors, our new buddies, and provided an overview of the game to help any that were able to get to the matches. The games were not close. South Melbourne's first home game at Princes Park started with a 38-point win over Collingwood. Tommy Laeth was recognised for his fine game, but he would soon be playing for Hawthorn. Reigning premiers Melbourne continued their tradition of slow starts with a 54-point loss to Essendon at Windy Hill. Fitzroy beat St Kilda, North Melbourne beat Hawthorn, and Richmond were too strong for Footscray. One of the most poignant moments of the season came in round 2. Earlier in the week, Checker Hughes picked up his telephone and a young man asked if he would be interested in a good half-forward. Checker tried to explain that he was out of football and the caller should contact Pat Kennedy at Melbourne. But the caller insisted. "But I'm a very good footballer, Mr. Hughes, and I was told to get in contact with you." Hughes again told the caller to contact Pat Kennedy. The caller persisted though. "But Mr. Hughes, I played in your 1939 team, and I thought I'd have another go." Hughes was puzzled, but alert. However, he just couldn't place the voice. He thought it might be Bluey Truscott, and he went out to the showgrounds to find him, which became something of a mission in itself. Bluey had already returned to his family home. Truscott's return became a media firestorm. He was one of the most famous servicemen in Australia, having shot down at least 11 German aircraft and damaged a destroyer, receiving a Distinguished Flying Cross and 2 bars, as reported by the football record in round 1, in anticipation of his return. He was immediately put into the Melbourne team for their round 2 game against Richmond, despite no training or match condition, and having some trouble getting back into his footy gear, including the number 1 jumper. Percy Beames elevated Truscott to captain for the day. It was Melbourne's first home game at their new home ground, and the unfurling of the 1941 Premiership flag was completely overshadowed by the focus on Truscott by journalists, spectators, officials, teammates and opponents. Jack Dyer took Truscott to the Richmond supporters and called for 3 cheers, which echoed around the ground. That's where the fun ended, and the reality of football began. Bluey was a very good player in his day, but he was in no condition to play. There was no chance of him retiring to the bench, and Richmond had no interest in harming the national treasure. The Tigers' ruckman, Bob Borden, pulled out of a potentially bruising encounter, and Bluey thanked him for his courtesy. During the second quarter, Bluey turned to Richmond's George Smeaton and said, "Making it a bit hot, aren't you? Might give a bloke a kick." George replied, "If I go any slower, I'll be crawling after you on my hands and knees." In the third quarter, the umpire intervened, giving Bluey a free kick for a push in the back right in front of goal. Over the years, a legend has grown that Jack Dyer deliberately dropped a mark in the goal square, allowing Bluey to score, but all contemporary reports noted the free kick. Perhaps Jack deliberately pushed Bluey in the back to give him the free. Regardless, Bluey kicked straight and was cheered by all at the ground. It didn't matter. Despite a seesawing game, the Tigers ran away in the last quarter, kicking 12 goals. It was Truscott's last game. He turned 26 the next day, and he was soon flying kitty hawks in New Guinea. Sadly, he was killed when his plane crashed in March 1943. Back to a less eventful Round 2 game, where South Melbourne at their new home ground of Princes Park were playing Carlton. In a sign of the times and a preview of what many clubs would go through, South made 10 changes to their Round 1 side in order to get a team on the ground. Despite the changes, or maybe because of the changes, they beat the Blues by 40 points. Essendon made some changes in their Round 2 game against Footscray, with Australian Football Hall of Fame legend Bill Hutchinson making his debut in what would be an illustrious 290-game career. But he almost didn't get onto the ground. The babyface Hutchinson looked so young, the doorman wasn't letting him into the change rooms until Captain Coach Dick Reynolds confirmed he was in the team. Hutchinson would play 11 games in his first season, and by the end of his career, Dick Reynolds said of Hutchinson, "He was a great team man, and he was the greatest footballer I met in my career. As far as I'm concerned, he was 1 in a million," which is high praise indeed coming from a player as good as Dick Reynolds. Richmond's season got off to a flying start, kicking 99 goals in the first 4 games, 30 in Round 1, then 19, 25 in Round 3 and 25 again in Round 4 to sit well clear on top of the ladder. The Round 6 match of the day between unbeaten Essendon and unbeaten Richmond nearly ended in a riot at Windy Hill. At the end of the game, Essendon was 1 point up, and players and officials seemed not to have heard the bell as the crowd rushed onto the ground. Richmond supporters were angry because the Bombers had kicked a goal after the bell at the end of the first quarter, but the umpire did not hear the time signal and the goal counted. Order was soon restored by the players themselves, who realised the game was over. Richmond's president, Harry Dyke, adopted a mature and realistic approach to the question of the disputed goal at the end or after the end of the first quarter. He said, "The umpire allowed it, and that's all that matters. Why, we won a match ourselves with a goal after the bell at Richmond a few years ago." Perhaps a few modern-day commentators and officials could take a similar, pragmatic approach, recognising close calls fall both ways over time, as we try to analyse every decision with multiple replays from multiple angles, rather than rely on the umpire's call. By the end of Round 6, Essendon were on top of the ladder with 6 wins in a row. Richmond had 5 wins, after that controversial 1-point loss to the Bombers. The Tigers' high-scoring start to the season, giving them a very impressive percentage of 168%. South Melbourne, Fitzroy and Footscray followed on 4 wins, separated by percentage. Then Carlton, North and St Kilda on 3 wins, all still competing for a spot in the top 4. In a relatively even start to the season, Hawthorn, with some new VFA players, had won 2 games. The Glenferrie club broke a 17-year hoodoo with their first ever win against Collingwood. It must have been a good night at Glenferrie Oval after that win. The big surprises were reigning premiers Melbourne, sitting 11th with just 1 win, and Collingwood on the bottom of the ladder, also with just 1 win. They had both been dominant teams, yet enlistments and the challenge of getting a team onto the ground each week had hurt both clubs badly. While Melbourne, Footscray, South Melbourne and St Kilda were all playing at new home grounds, there was still some rearranging to avoid fixture clashes. For example, in Round 6, both South and Carlton were due to play at home. Carlton got to play at Princes Park, and South hosted Fitzroy at Toorak Oval. Given St Kilda were playing Melbourne at Punt Road, supporters and players had to check each week to make sure they knew which ground to go to in this unusual season. Round 8 was the final week for Bob McCaskill as coach of North Melbourne. He was not sacked, but did not resign by choice. Unfortunately for the Arden Street team, Warrant Officer McCaskill was transferred interstate by the Army, so Bill Finley took over as captain coach. We will see McCaskill back at North after the war, and he will continue the good work he had started under such difficult conditions. Richmond had a bye in round 10 and took the opportunity to organise a game against a services team with several league and association players on the Sunday. It had to be the Sunday, as many of the services players could not get leave on the Saturday, nor did they want to compete against the league fixture. This caused Richmond's delegate, Harry Dyke, all sorts of challenges at the league meeting before the game, as he tried to explain that the Richmond club was definitely against Sunday play, supporting the league's position formalised in an existing motion against the scandalous concept of Sunday football. Yet this case was different. There was money being raised for patriotic causes, and this was definitely not the Richmond League team, but just a Richmond team. It was noted by one of the delegates that there would be Richmond players in that Richmond team, perhaps wanting to avoid the bad publicity of opposing a patriotic fundraising match. League President Dr. McClellan ruled that it was not a league matter and the league had no power, which, to me, seems very much like, let's just pretend one of our clubs isn't about to break a rule that we have already made. The whole question of Sunday football was referred to a subcommittee, which is the other traditional manner of dealing with difficult topics. The game was held on Sunday the 12th of July, with 30,000 people attending, one of the biggest crowds of the season, with many attracted by both the patriotic cause and the chance to see a services team wearing South Melbourne colours, with Ron Todd, Bob Pratt, Fons Kine, captained by Alan LaFontaine. Both LaFontaine and Kine were still playing for Melbourne and Collingwood respectively, and had played on the day before. The Tigers had had the bye, but the Richmond team that played on the Sunday had Keith Stackpole Sr. and Noel Price from Fitzroy as guest players, proving the point that this was a team from Richmond and not the Richmond VFL team, despite the fact they wore Richmond jumpers and the game was at Punt Road. The Richmond team won the game 20 goals 13, 133 to 19 goals 1, 125. As well as raising £850 for patriotic funds, spectators saw Pratt kick 7 goals, which would have been a bittersweet moment for South Melbourne supporters, seeing their former champion in his Swans jumper one more time. Jack Titus got 8 goals for the Tigers, for the team from Richmond, to round out the entertainment and show the skills on display for both teams. A great result for everyone but the VFL, who rushed through legislation banning VFL teams from playing games other than those sanctioned by the league. The league also replied to a letter from the Presbyterian Young Men's Fellowship, who had written to the league protesting Sunday games, other than those between the various fighting services, as a violation of the sanctity of the Sabbath. The league confirmed they agreed with the Presbyterian young men and noted they had passed a resolution to the point. The league's attitude to Sunday football and community attitudes to the sanctity of the Sabbath has changed over the decades. While the VFL had been opposed to the privately organised Sunday games held in 1941 to raise patriotic funds, and they did not want VFL clubs playing on Sundays, 1942 saw many more men enlisted, often with their only day off on Sundays. A Sunday football competition started in June with teams from various branches of the armed services, with support and umpires from the VFL. Despite the opposition of some in the community, most saw it as a great opportunity of entertaining the many servicemen camped around Melbourne, as well as a chance to see players from the VFA and VFL that were no longer playing with their regular team. After round 12, only one side could be sure of the finals. Another 3 teams were most likely to make the finals, and 2 clubs were hoping they could sneak in, despite the shortened season. Essendon were a game clear on top with 10 wins, followed by Richmond, South Melbourne and Footscray on 9 wins, and sitting just outside of the 4 were Carlton and Fitzroy on 8 wins. There was only 4 games to go, but the Blues and Maroons were still hopeful of finals action. Carlton had won their last 4 games in a row to overcome a slow start to the season. St Kilda were on 6 wins, but not in contention, followed by North Melbourne, Melbourne, Collingwood and Hawthorn. While supporters of the Mayblooms knew what it was like to be sitting at the end of the list, it was a significant change for Collingwood, a club who'd been so strong for almost all of their years in the VFL, and Melbourne were 10th, despite winning the last 3 premierships in a row. With 2 rounds left, Richmond had taken back top spot when Carlton gave the Dons a thumping at Princess Park that lifted the Blues to 5th, leaping over Fitzroy, who somehow managed to lose a must-win game against lowly Melbourne. South Melbourne, Footscray and Carlton were all on 10 wins. Carlton kept their hopes alive and completely knocked Fitzroy out of contention by winning that round 15 game. The Bulldogs had a bye and South had a big win over North Melbourne, critical as it looked like the final 4 spots could be decided by percentages. In the final round, only Richmond and Essendon were assured of a top 4 spot, but they could swap between first and second depending on results, while Carlton had to win and hope Footscray or South lost. Essendon had an easy win over North Melbourne, and then watched with amazement as the scores from the Carlton-Richmond game went up. The Tigers had been behind at 3/4 time, but they were playing for top spot, and they had been one of the best teams all year. But the Blues kicked 4 goals to 1 in the last quarter to storm home. The Tigers dropped to second spot. South were playing Melbourne, who were showing some late-season improvement, winning the previous 2 games in a row. Carlton supporters had their hopes raised when they saw that Melbourne had kicked 6 goals in the last quarter, but South had kicked 4, and that was enough to win. Blues fans now waited for the result from Yarraville. Could the Maroons have taken down the Bulldogs and let Carlton slip into the 4? Sadly, for the Princess Park team, the answer was no. They had won their last 8 games in a row, knocked off the top 2 teams in the last 3 weeks of the season, and yet all they had to show for it was the 1942 Almostus Award for just missing the finals. They had been close, but not close enough. It was a common experience for the Blues. They had finished 5th 5 times in 16 years, while making the 4 in the other 11 years. Despite not finishing lower than 5th in 16 years, they only had the 1 premiership in 1938 to show for that consistent performance. A frustrating era for Blues supporters. Fitzroy had been hopeful of finally returning to the top 4, but, as in previous years, fell away towards the end of the season. St Kilda finished 7th on 6 wins. Reigning premiers Melbourne would not defend their flag, 8th with only 5 wins, and North were 9th with 4 wins. Collingwood avoided the wooden spoon by defeating Hawthorn in the final game of the season for their 2nd win, but that would have been small comfort for that proud club. And Hawthorn, who had contemplated not playing the season, might have wondered why they did, with only 1 win. 3rd place South Melbourne would play Footscray in the first semi-final, and Essendon would take on Richmond in the second semi. There were no Brownlow votes to count in this war-affected season. That award would not return until peacetime. The first semi-final was on August 29 at Princess Park, the first time a semi-final had been played there since 1905 when Fitzroy beat Essendon, unless you count the round-robin matches of 1924 as semi-finals, but who wanted to remember that odd final series? The previews were split between South and Footscray. The Bulldogs, favoured by the Sun, who saw the return of Ambrose Palmer from injury, providing a winning advantage in the ruck, while the Herald thought South were favoured to win, playing on their new home ground and having beaten Footscray by 5 goals in round 9. South supporters would have also noted that Footscray had only won 1 game at Princess Park in their 17 seasons in the VFL, way back in 1931. 25,000 people saw a solemn opening of the game, marked by the band playing The Last Post and God Save the King. South won the toss and kicked with the wind towards the Princess Hill end. The first quarter was even, but it was not attractive football. Perhaps both clubs were nervous in their first finals game in some years. There were 10 shots at goal by both teams, yet only 2 went through the middle. It was 1 goal 4 each at quarter time. Footscray could have closed the game out in the second quarter, but they seemed determined to kick behinds rather than goals. South did not get the ball in their forward line as often as the Bulldogs, but they were much more efficient. At half-time, the Swans trailed a wasteful Footscray, 3 goals 5 to 3-14. The second half belonged to South Melbourne, who took complete possession of the game, while the Bulldogs continued to waste their chances, hitting the post 5 times on the way to a final, inaccurate total of 7 goals, 22 behinds, 64, to South on 13 goals 13, 91. The Bulldogs' captain coach Norm Ware had a day to forget, kicking 3 goals, 14 behinds. Footscray season was over. South were into the preliminary final. Richmond and Essendon had been the leading teams throughout the season, and 32,000 people made their way to Princes Park for the second semi-final. Essendon had finished the season on top and were favoured by many. Yet the only game between the two heavyweights this season was a 1-point win by Essendon, after a disputed goal earlier in that game, so most expected a close match. Richmond players wore black armbands in tribute to former premiership player, reserves coach and committeeman Bert Foster, who had been killed in a road accident in the week before the game. The first half was a disappointing affair, with the game below premiership standard. Kicks went astray, players from both sides fumbled, and the defenders dominated forwards. Richmond had a 3-point lead at half-time, but neither side could say they played well. In the second half, it was the Tigers who dominated, switching to non-stop running football, led by the likes of Jack Dyer, Jack Titus and Dick Harris, who between them scored 10 of the Tigers' 11 goals. The loss continued Essendon's run of defeats at Princes Park. Their last win there was in May 1925. If they wanted to meet Richmond again in the grand final, they would have to change that record when they played South Melbourne in the preliminary final. Most players who'd been in a semi-final would be glad of the time off before the grand final, but Jack Dyer, Leo Merritt, Dick Harris and Skinny Jack Titus from Richmond, as well as Wally Buttsworth, Hugh Tawney and Gordon Lane from Essendon, pulled on the boots again on the Sunday as part of a combined league team playing a services team to raise money for prisoners of war. At least the Richmond players could look forward to 2 weeks off. The 3 Essendon players had just lost a semi-final and would be in a preliminary final next Saturday, but they still took part. There were plenty of current and former league players in the services team, such as Nash, Todd, LaFontaine, Mueller, Brownlow medalist Norm Ware, and more. So there were 2 good teams out in the park for a good cause. The services team beat the league side when Jack Titus could not make the distance with a shot after the bell. Perhaps his legs were a bit tired after 2 games in 2 days. Or maybe he wanted to let the services team win. He copped some barracking for the miss, but declared he had broken down after having carried the other 17 players through the game. 15,000 people were at Punt Road for yet another Sunday game, which raised £537 for the Prisoners of War funds. South Melbourne's plans for their preliminary final were thrown out when Alan Mullinger was suspended for 2 weeks after his altercation with Footscray's Norm Chisholm. Despite Chisholm saying he did not know that he'd been hit, the evidence of the field and boundary umpires was considered to be more accurate. Even if South won the preliminary final, Mullinger would be out of the grand final. 26,000 were at Princes Park for the preliminary final to see if South could make another grand final, having endured a lean stretch after their glory days of the 1930s Foreign Legion sides, while Essendon was hoping to recover from the semi-final loss, not wanting to waste a season spent on top or near the top of the ladder. But there was that 17-year streak of losses at Princes Park. That had to be overcome. And South were playing on their new home ground, now quite familiar with Princes Park after a season in changed circumstances. The first 2 finals had been disappointing spectacles, but this match was a beauty. After an even first half, South led by 5 points. At half-time, Reynolds addressed his teammates, making it clear what he expected and the consequences of failure. Decades later, centre-half forward Ted Leon recalled, "Dick gave us a real rousing up. He told us what he expected in very direct terms. And that's the only time I can recall Dick really named players and got stuck into everybody. That message really got through because we were a different team in the third quarter." Yet, South could have gone further ahead if not for some poor shots at goal. 4 easy chances were missed. Then something clicked with the Bombers. The Dick Reynolds half-time address did its job. As Gerald Brosnan said in The Sun, Essendon smothered South with pace and science. Players showed keen anticipation. Passing was accurate. Players made space and kicking for goal was accurate. It was clever, entertaining football, worthy of a final. In contrast to South, Essendon had 4 difficult shots at goal and got them all. South fought the game out well. Lindsay White had debuted for Geelong in 1941, kicking 67 goals in his first season, but now was playing for South on a temporary clearance, and he had a stunning game in the forward line to top off his season. He kicked 9 goals, including all 4 of South's goals in the first quarter, and a 60-yard drop kick early in the third. He finished the 1942 season with 80 goals, a great pickup for South, given in normal times White still would have been playing for Geelong. While all of that was going on, St Kilda supporters had something to cheer about at the Punt Road Oval, where the Saints won their first reserves premiership, beating Fitzroy. A club that had been founded almost 70 years earlier in 1873 now had a reserves premiership to go alongside their patriotic premiership won in 1940. It would still be more than 2 decades before they got that elusive first seniors premiership, but that's for another episode. Stories and myths sometimes emerge around grand finals, and there's one story often told about the 1942 grand final. In fact, Jack Dyer told it first in his biography, but that was in 1965, more than 20 years after the event, and long before the magic of the internet provided an easy way of checking newspapers from long ago, and military records that were once only available to officials and public servants. I'm referring to the tale of Bill Cosgrove. Much of what is told in several books is true, but unfortunately, Jack got the timing wrong with his book, and so you will continue to see it reported here and there. Bill Cosgrove's story is extraordinary. He did play 3 games for Richmond at the start of the 1940 season before his duties with the RAAF took priority. He flew over 50 missions in the Middle East and Pacific theatres in a variety of aircraft. He did name each of his planes Jack Dyer and emblazoned them with the Richmond war cry, "Eat 'em alive!" as a tribute to Jack Dyer and the Richmond Football Club. He even took part in an amazing escape from Java in March 1942, having flown with his Blenheim bomber squadron from the Middle East to Java. They were quickly overrun by invading Japanese forces. Cosgrove was one of 12 men who escaped in a 9-metre lifeboat, sailing 1,500 miles over 44 days, allowed to pass by a Japanese sub, who observed them but allowed them to sail on, and visited by a curious whale, who raised its head not a metre from the rudder, staring at the boat with its large eye. Before moving on, the small boat nearly floundered in tropical storms, before being rescued by an American Navy Catalina flying boat near Roebourne on the northwest coast of Western Australia. An amazing escape. Jack Dyer told of getting a letter in May 1942 from Cosgrove's commanding officer, sharing the news of his death and reporting how much he loved the Richmond Football Club and that he would be with the team in spirit. The officer told Jack, "Go in and win, Mr. Dyer." Jack recalled using that as motivation for the 1942 season and grand final. However, the reality is, Bill was in Australia in 1942, training after his great escape, before being posted to New Guinea in April 1943. The Sporting Globe doing a profile piece in May 1943, describing his experiences and the planes he flew. Perhaps it was Bill who wrote to Jack back in May 1942. Sadly, Bill Cosgrove was killed in August 1943, flying a plane named Jack Dyer 4. So it is possible that the letter that Jack Dyer received from his commanding officer arrived later during the 1943 season and was inspiration for the finals that season. So the story is true, just a year later than how Jack remembered it. And if you think the Cosgrove name sounds familiar in a military context, Bill was the uncle of former Australian Defence Forces leader and Governor-General Peter Cosgrove. Richmond's best first-year player receives the Jenkins Cosgrove Medal, named after Charles Jenkins, an influential Richmond recruiter, and Bill Cosgrove, the RAAF pilot who loved the club, but did not get to finish his first season. This would be Jack Dyer's first grand final as captain coach of the Tigers, while he'll be forever known as Captain Blood after the Hollywood pirate movie of the time. His teammates called him Bing, for his unique crooning version of Bing Crosby's classic When the Blue of the Night. Mark Noble was one of the experienced trainers at Punt Road, and he was Jack's go-to man for massages and treatment after games and during the week. When asked what Dyer spoke about during those treatments, Noble said, "Never himself. Mostly he discusses the way that young players in both teams are shaping. He's always keen about helping our own youngsters." Dyer had led the Tigers for 2 seasons, and the veteran was looking to collect a second premiership to match the 1934 centenary premiership in his 4th season, which would also go along with the 4 Best and Fairest awards that he'd already won, which, since 1964, has been named in his honour. Dick Reynolds was taking the Dons into their 2nd grand final in a row. He had been appointed captain coach midway through the 1939 season when Jack Baggott resigned. The team improved under his leadership, making the finals in the next season and finishing runners-up in 1941. Now, players of this era all had full-time jobs, most working Saturday mornings. For Reynolds, it was his grocery delivery business. Decades before Amazon, Reynolds was one of many, providing home delivery of food and other essentials. Every Saturday morning, one young supporter, Keith Smith, would stand by his gate with a football tucked under his arm, waiting for Reynolds to bring the weekly order, and Dick would always stop, despite it being his busiest day, for a quick chat and maybe some kick-to-kick. Every Saturday afternoon, Keith Smith would walk out into the ground at 3/4 time to get an orange or a piece of chewing gum from the Essendon captain coach. Despite his friendship, Keith had never actually seen Reynolds play. Keith was blind, but Reynolds always made him feel part of the team. Reynolds had a way of connecting with people. Dick Reynolds did not just rely on his own skill or personality or connection to people to provide inspiration to his teammates. He was also recognised for introducing a systematic style of play that is reminiscent of the Collingwood machine. But would it be enough to go one better than 1941? The umpire for the grand final was Eric Hawkins, officiating in his 2nd grand final in a row after starting with the league back in 1936. He'd umpired all the finals for 1942, becoming the 8th field umpire to achieve that feat, and the first to do it at Princes Park. The Herald, the Sun and the Argus all tipped Essendon, despite Richmond having won the semi-final, and the fact that Essendon had to play 3 weeks in a row, while Richmond had earned the week off. Yet the Bombers had finished the season on top of the ladder and been very impressive in their win over South Melbourne. The Friday papers gave significant coverage to Richmond's decision to omit Bill Morris. Richmond secretary Murray Fleming told the reporters that the club had not seen Bill for 2 weeks and were not sure of his condition. Morris's army duties were keeping him away from training, and he had not played since round 16. Yet, just minutes before the start of play, when the Tigers finally did name their side, Bill Morris, a future Brownlow medalist, was in the team, and so was rugged back pocket Joe Riley for just his 8th game of the season. His last game had been in round 15. The 2 unlucky players were backman Ian Hull, who had been in the team for most of the season and would miss the following 2 years on war duties before returning for 6 games in 1945, and also missing out was Len Ablett, who had played all season as well. He would return for another chance in 1943. And if you think that Ablett name sounds familiar, he did come from Myrtleford, and he was the uncle of Jeff, Ken and Gary Ablett Sr. Some fine genes running in that Ablett family. Debuting in a final is an extraordinary moment for any league player. But imagine this, spending your entire league career playing finals against the same opponent. Now that's a rarity worth talking about. Richmond had selected Bob Hay in the semi-final, as predicted by Jack Dyer in the Sporting Globe, giving his fine performance in the Motors team in the inter-services competition and 1 game in the reserves. He was a big man who could help out Richmond in the forward line. Bob kept his spot in the grand final team, also against Essendon, for his 2nd and last VFL game. He served in the Army in World War II and beyond. He had a distinguished Army career, eventually serving as a commander of the Australian military forces in Vietnam and commandant of the Royal Military College Don Troon, achieving the rank of Major General. He did come back to the Tigers after World War II, winning a reserves premiership in 1946, but never returned to the seniors again. A short, 2-game, unique VFL career, finals only, and an important military career. 49,000 people, the biggest crowd for the season gathered at Princes Park. Plenty got there early to get a decent spot, and they watched the curtain raiser to fill in time. With the reserves grand final being decided a week earlier, this game was the Melbourne Boys Association Under-16 grand final, where Melbourne United, 9 goals 8-62, defeated Kew Juniors 7 goals 11-53. An absolute thrill for all the boys to be playing before the VFL grand final in front of nearly 50,000 people. The anthem before the game was performed by the Collingwood Citizens Band, while the crowd, hats off, stood to attention. Jack Dyer won the toss and chose to kick with the wind. There was some crowded play early in the quarter, or, as the Essendon Gazette later described it, some knockdown tactics. The Bombers were getting the ball into their forward line, but kicked 6 behinds in a row, much to the frustration of their supporters. Late goals to Murray Exelby and Gordon Lane got them back into a rhythm, and it was Essendon who took a 2-point lead in at quarter time. Nothing went right for the Tigers in the second quarter. Young rover Fred Burge injured himself with a badly torn muscle in the hip, replaced by 19th man Des Martin. Des kicked a goal at the start of the second quarter, but after that, Richmond's goal kicking was shocking. Meanwhile, Essendon players were getting loose and causing damage. Dick Reynolds was asserting his authority, and the Bombers were taking control of the game. It showed on the scoreboard at the main break. Essendon 8 goals 14-62 to Richmond 4 goals 4-28. At half-time, a broadcasting van with loudspeaker attached drove onto the ground, and both Jack Dyer and Dick Reynolds took time out of their break to promote their wartime austerity loan, a key fundraising drive for the government, important enough to interrupt grand final half-time. Richmond needed quick goals to start the third term, but instead, Bob Borden, Jack Simmons and Brian Randall all missed gettable shots. Essendon did not waste their opportunities, and their goals came quickly. Centre-half forward Gordon Lane scored 3 goals in the quarter, and there were plenty of others joining in. A 6-goal-2 quarter showed the Dons' dominance. It was becoming frustrating for the Tigers. There were a number of scuffles breaking out across the ground. The game was over, but there was 1 quarter to play. Essendon kicked another 3 goals to start the last quarter, just to squeeze any interest out of the game. Richmond did finish with a run of goals, which gave the Tigers a more respectable total, but Essendon largely maintained the gap without too much effort for a 53-point win. It was one of those one-sided grand finals, great for the winning team and their supporters, terrible for the losing team, and boring for their neutral fans looking for one last good game of football. The final score was Essendon 19 goals 18, 132 to Richmond 11 goals 13, 79. Dick Reynolds had led from the front and was widely considered the best player, kicking 4 goals, and he was always in the play. Hector Lacey in the Sporting Globe said, "No one had been able to stop Reynolds as he skirted the pack or dived through with the ball, always to give it to a teammate." 6 players were reported, 4 from Richmond and 2 from Essendon. The Tigers' George Smeaton was suspended for 4 weeks in a tribunal session that did not happen until December, given the challenges of getting all the parties together, with military service taking priority. George didn't mind. He was going to spend the next 2 years in the army anyway. Normally, after a grand final, the losing captain or coach will swallow their pride and hurt and visit the opposition rooms to congratulate the better team on the day. Jack Dyer was not in the mood for that. His players were hurt, embarrassed on the biggest day of the season, and when he went into the Essendon rooms and saw them laughing and giggling, he could not help himself. He got up onto a bench and gave them a serve. "You can laugh. My players are over there crying. They can't taste their beer. They hate your guts. And all your laughing. Well, enjoy it, because next year I'll be waiting over there for you, Reynolds, and then it'll be your turn to cry. I'm congratulating you, but I don't mean a word of it. We were beaten by 7 goals. We should have won." It was not done in good grace, and he did not acknowledge the better team. But it was honest and raw, and it would set up an interesting rematch in 1943. Essendon went off to the Hotel Australia for their victory dinner, followed by a social evening at the Windy Hill Pavilion, while Richmond had their post-game dinner at Richmond Town Hall. The Dons had no rest after the grand final. mixing celebrations with training for an exhibition game against the services team next Saturday at Princes Park. Essendon only had one change in their team, with 19th man Sid Silk replacing Wally Buttsworth, who had an injured shoulder. They were up against a services team made up of VFL and VFA stars. As mentioned earlier, many VFA players had joined league clubs when the association went into recess, but there were several players like Pratt, Todd and Nash, who had left the league without a clearance and not been allowed to rejoin VFL clubs. They had kept their football skills by playing in various service teams and were keen to show how they could still hold their own against the best club in the league. It was a close game, with just 1 point separating the sides at three-quarter time, but the Premiership team was too strong in the last stanza, Essendon winning by 27 points in what was described as a thrilling game with over 10,000 people watching. Richmond were not resting either. They travelled to Sale a fortnight after the grand final to take on an RAAF team, winning another close game. On the same weekend, Essendon played their second post-grand final game, this time against a combined Ballarat team. The players were not at the front, but they were doing their best to make a contribution to the war effort. At the next delegates' meeting, it was observed that the traditional allocation of premiership medallions was in doubt, given the difficulty in obtaining medals, with all metal prioritised for war efforts. Traditionally, these were presented at the next AGM for the premiership team, but there was no mention of medallions at Essendon's next AGM, so it looks like no premiership medallions for 1942 due to the war. The VFL delegates also criticised the VFA, given the association had not responded to 2 invitations to meet with the VFL and the Victorian Junior Football Union to discuss the future of football in wartime and the post-war environment. It was declared that the VFA was only a secondary body, and the league should engage with the union as if the association did not exist. No love lost still between the VFL and the VFA, even with the gentleman's agreement in place. After the grand final, with the dividends from the final series allocated to clubs, the league also made a significant investment of £3,300 in the government austerity loan, which brought the total contribution to patriotic funds between the league and clubs to over £20,000 for 1942 alone, equivalent to about $1.8 million in today's money. It was one good reason for keeping football going. So that was the 1942 season. It was a smaller competition without Geelong. Clubs were on unfamiliar grounds. They had struggled at times to get teams onto the field. Training was severely limited. Crowds were down, but there were still people in Melbourne wanting to get to a game, and those serving in uniform were keen to track the season's progress. Sunday games had been played, but not embraced by the league, and significant funds had been donated to patriotic causes. The best team had won the premiership, and the league could be pleased with the results of a challenging season, and planning would start for 1943. While all of that was happening in Melbourne, in 1942 there was another important football season unfolding, 6,000 kilometres away in the Changi prison camp in Singapore. I'll do a supplementary episode on that important part of football history before we look at the 1943 season, which would have its own unique twists and turns. If you've enjoyed Grand Final history, please leave a review wherever you get your podcast from. The more goals we kick, the easier it is for others to find the podcast. If you have questions or want to leave feedback, please email me at info@grandfinalhistory.au or check out the grandfinalhistory.au website or Facebook or Twitter or Blue Sky for more Grand Final history.